Hello, Penny. I've just realised, well, Penny's just explained to me backstage, as I'm going to grandly call it, that whole performance, like the script, the text was improvised, which I just think is absolutely extraordinary. So congratulations. And we'll talk a bit more about Birdswoman later on. I want to start our conversation today by basically giving a bit of a kind of context to I think it's 2 bodies of photographs that were particularly used in the photo series for an Exorcism, and kind of talking a bit about the genesis of the series. So there are photographs of Lilford Hall that I believe were taken in 1969,
right,
when you were making a film with Peter Whitehead and Susanka Frey. And then there's a later series of photographs of the 3 of you that were taken in the 1970s. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about, first of all, the film that was the original context for the photographs of the house, and then a bit about the later photo series?
Right. Well, we went to Lilford Hall in 1969, we being Peter Whitehead and myself, and it was after we just got together, and we were in the first flush of our relationship, and it was very much a creative relationship, but we were dreaming of making movies together. And so we were looking for the right set, and we went off on this magical mystery tour to find this building that Peter thought might be very much to my taste, and it was a big old empty mansion house that was in the countryside in Northamptonshire, and he'd stayed there when he was a student at Oxford. So we went on this tour and by good fortune found it. And when we did, as soon as I saw the place, I was totally enchanted by it. It was this amazing edifice, but empty, deserted, and like a canvas, just waiting to be painted on. So we went to find the owner, and Peter knew him and knew how to find him, and he gave us permission to film there. So we stayed. It was really 3 days and nights that we stayed there. And for the first part, we had my girlfriend Susanka with us, and we shot the footage that's now known as Lilford Hall. And I hadn't seen that footage for nearly 50 years. It was in Peter's archives, just sitting there. And when Peter and I got together and talked about it, I said I'd really love to see it. And so he got it out, I made digital copies of it, and he gave me permission to use it and show it. And when I saw it, the copies that came out were straight out of the cans, and in the order that they just were copied out of the cans. But I loved it so much. It was somehow by the laws of chance that they just had this really evocative, timeless feel. And you know, with rushes, you've got something repeated again and again. But I love that repetition, because I've always been very interested in film in a non-linear kind of sense. Film that would take you into a timeless place rather than being strictly linear and narrative. So this really appealed to me, and I've been showing it like that. It's possible I'll make something out of parts of it at some time, but right now I'm very much enjoying sharing this, and we showed it the other day at the Horse Hospital with a live soundtrack, which really helped to just make it something very palatable rather than this long, silent venture into a weird ambient space that didn't have much form. It's very kind of amoebic. And at the time, before we left, we took photographs of all the rooms and the grounds, and all of them were empty and desolate. And in fact, I printed out 2 sets of prints. And only recently, well, not that recently now, a few years ago when I saw Peter, he told me that we decided that we were both going to make collages from this set of photographs, and each have a complete set, and I would do mine, and he would do his, and we'd do them in secret, and then at the end we'd compare them. And we thought this would be an incredible exercise in trying to see how the male psyche and the female psyche approach things and what that looked like, and then bring them together in some kind of marriage and show that. But Peter decided not to do it. He said, oh, that's Penny's thing, I think. And so unfortunately, he didn't, but fortunately, I was able to. But I was only galvanized into making this series when my relationship with Peter fell apart. And when that fell apart, and it was due to my relationship with the women's theatre group, Holocaust, run by Jane Arden, and it was the first all-woman theatre group. And when I was involved with the film, The Other Side of the Underneath, I went the whole way with the film against Peter's wishes, and he wanted me to stop at a certain point and come back. And I said, I can't, I'm in it now, and I have to see it through to the end. And doing that, he saw as a betrayal that he could not forgive. And so I came back to see him, but unfortunately the hurt was too deep, and although we tried to resurrect it, it couldn't be. And also the women's theatre group fell apart after the film, and that didn't stay together. So I felt like a lost soul. This fallen angel that came to see you just now was flailing around, feeling very lost, and like I didn't know who I was anymore, my male part and my female part. It was all in tatters. And so I embarked upon this journey of self-discovery and self-actualization, which came to be known as this Exorcism series. And in that exorcism, I was trying to release myself and exorcise myself from the things that I felt held me back and limited my potential, and then to be able to grasp the things that I felt could help me evolve and realize my full potential. So in that process, and it was a long process, it went over 7 years. The book came out in '77, the first version of An Exorcism. And in that time, I was exploring all these different aspects of myself in the different rooms. And as each part of this kind of became clearer, the story that I wanted to tell, I needed the photographic material to illustrate that. And to Peter's credit, although we were no longer together, he did allow me to use him as a muse. And I photographed him and Susanka. He photographed me and Susanka. And this process went on with several shoots over those years in the early 70s.
Because, I mean, they're intense. You know, there's photographs of you masturbating, there's Peter with an erection, there's, you know, various different kinds of sexual coupling going on. So to manage that situation, I think, is quite extraordinary. Was it very challenging to...
Well, it was, that part of it wasn't that hard, really. I saw Sue the other day, and she said what fun we were having. We were cracking up with laughter when we were doing it. And also, just incidentally, the photos of me lying back and touching myself, those were done nude in the desert in Iran. When we went, and in part of when I came back, the journey we went on together, we went to the south of France and stayed with Mick Jagger. Peter was meant to do a film with them. That never actualized. We went to Iran because we were meant to be filming Peter Brook's production in Persepolis. That never actualized. And we were just in this terrible state. But in that time, I managed to get out of the car and go into the desert and be photographed by Peter nude in the desert in Iran, which, when I look back on it, I think how totally crazy that was. But that's the kind of thing we did in the process of actualizing these images.
How extraordinary. That's absolutely amazing. So just to kind of pull back a little bit, the publication of the book was supported by Roland Penrose, and yes. I think we should probably contextualise who Roland Penrose was and how you came to know him. So Roland Penrose was an artist, a curator, a writer, and a great supporter of the he was almost like the ambassador of surrealism to the UK. So he co-organised the International Surrealist Exhibition in the 1930s with Herbert Reed that had Salvador Dali turning up in a diving helmet and all kinds of shenanigans going on. So how did you come into contact with Roland Penrose, and how did he come to support the book?
When I was at Chelsea Art School, and I decided to do my thesis on Max Ernst, his collage books in particular, La Femme Sans Tête and Semaine de Monte, I was looking around and thinking, well, who in England can I go and talk to about surrealism? Because in our art school training, we didn't really get much exposure to surrealism at all, or collage. And I had a sort of erstwhile boyfriend at the time called the Right Honourable Robert Erskine, And Robert Erskine said, "Oh, my friend Sir Roland, he's the person you should see." And so off I went to see Roland and ask him about Max Ernst. And then I found, when I met Roland, this incredible treasure trove of information and passion. I mean, he was friends with all the surrealists, so this was not some remote academic interest. This was his life and his passion, and his house in Horton Street in Kensington was filled with all these masterpieces, the Elephant of Salem, all these pieces were there, which he'd show me and talk to me about. And so he was a wonderful source for me in doing my thesis. And then at a certain point, before I handed in my thesis, I was in Paris with the art school, and Roland was over at that time, and he said, "I can take you to see Max Ernst." And so he took me to visit Max Ernst, and I was able to show him my thesis, where it was at, and ask him if he agreed with the approach I was taking, which he did. And so this wonderful meeting happened, and then I was able to hand in my thesis feeling very confident that I had the endorsement from the master himself. And that was great. And then Roland, after that, came to my diploma show at the end of my time at Chelsea. I showed all my work together. And when he came, he saw it, and he said, "Oh my goodness, Penny darling, I didn't know you made such beautiful things." And he was, at that point, president of the ICA, and he got me in an exhibition that summer of '69 called Young and Fantastic, which is all about where surrealism is now. And so I showed collages from 50% The Visible Woman, my mummy case, my bride in the bath, and my head boxes that I'd been making at Chelsea. All those were in the ICA the moment I came out of art school.
How extraordinary.
And then he was my patron for a few years after that.
Yeah, so you stayed in touch and he supported the publishing of the book.
Yes.
Obviously you're very well versed in surrealism, and there are quite a lot of kind of surrealist tropes that pop up in an exorcism. There's the kind of dismembered female body that's just seen as parts and various other things. Were you quite consciously kind of going, well, that was a bit of a boys' club and I'm going to do surrealism from a kind of like a female perspective?
Well, I didn't quite do that, because I was very enchanted with Max Ernst. And to me, Max Ernst wasn't at all chauvinist. He was Lop. He was this bird-headed being. You know, here we are. I'm in the tradition of Lop. So for me, he didn't really come across in a sexist kind of way. He came across much more pantheistic and able to inhabit all kinds of creatures as well as sexual identities. However, when I saw what he did with his collage books, I said, "Oh, this is fantastic. We can describe the inner world with these tools of surrealism and show the dreams, show the fantasies, show beneath the surface." But I don't see anyone having really done that for the female psyche. And that's what I want to do. So I took those tools that I found there and made my tribute, but made the tribute on my own terms. And I used photographic collage rather than old engravings. And I was trying to describe the inside of the feminine, because I felt that was like a virgin territory, which hadn't really been explored in the surrealists. Even though there were women surrealists, I didn't really see that particular facet taken out and aired. And that's what I wanted to do.
I'd love to know what kind of tools you use to access the subconscious, because we're talking a lot about, you know, getting into the underneath, and you're talking about bringing the insides to the outsides. Do you use your own dream imagery? Do you meditate? Do you do automatic writing? How do you kind of tap into this?
All of the above, really. Any way that we can get to the real goods, you know. I always was really interested in the inner world, because I found outside reality often very disappointing, but I always had a very rich inner life. And even as a child, I lived a lot in the world of my imagination, and I also found as an early age that I could stop boredom and loneliness by art. And so art was my friend, and to be able to find all the things that are inside rather than just look at what's outside was the place that fascinated me, and which seemed to be an endless font of unrestricted goodies that comes out of the self. You know, we have all of it inside ourselves. And so it's just finding those points of access, and all kind of tools for that. I mean, Jungian psychology was something I liked a lot. At the time I wrote the thesis, I used a lot of the ways that Jung approached things in symbols of transformation, psychology, and alchemy. I wasn't so keen on Freud because I found him reductionist and looking really just at the sort of sexual nature of things, but Jung was much more holistic, and he united spirit and flesh in the way that's obviously something I like to do. And so these kind of approaches are ones that I used on myself. And in fact, I saw a psychiatrist at one point after I'd broken up with Peter and was in this terrible mess of a being. And he said, after a couple of times, "You don't need to see me. You're doing your own psychoanalysis." And so I felt that I was. And that's really, you know, the process that I was involved in, how to dig deeply and to be totally candid. I felt if you can be really ruthlessly candid, then you can get to the archetypal level of things. And then it's not just about me as an individual. It's stuff that we all have to deal with. And if you get to the real roots of things, of viscera, the underbelly, then you can find stuff that just everybody can tap into from their own particular perspective.
Yeah, there's a wonderful phrase that I think you use about 50% of Visible Woman, which is, you describe it as a psychological striptease.
Right.
Yeah,
right,
which I think
right.
that's a lovely kind of description of it. So I'm fascinated. So this symbolic vocabulary that we see throughout an exorcism, because it's got a very distinctive, you know, it's got these repeating motifs. So you've got the roses, which have a very strong connection to feminine sexuality. We have the key. We have, you know, all these different motifs. So were you particularly kind of drawing on Jungian symbolism? Were there other things you were reading? Or was this very much a kind of self-generated symbolic vocabulary?
Well, it's that interface between what I see inside and receive myself in my dreams, in my meditations, in my visions. I mean, I'm always seeing so much in a visionary sense, and then finding things in the outside world that reflect that. And my favorite book at that time was Manly Hall's Secret Teachings of the Ages. So in Gnosticism and in ancient cultures and in cultures of the Orient, all of these places, I could find matches for that kind of mythology and symbolic language. And as a child too, I also loved, my favorite reading were fairy tales and myths and legends from all countries. And so that was where I abided in my inner planes. And so that's where I found this kind of mythic weave, which I felt applied to living a magical life, which unfortunately I found we're very much deprived of in the way that society's set up. But I wanted to get access to that and embody that.
That's very interesting, because I was going to ask you about the subtitle of the book, which is a photo romance, and I kind of felt like that was a bit of a kind of like a jab at the kind of pap that young girls are kind of fed, these picture stories where you're always meant to kind of fall for the guy and it all has the happy end. Was that?
Well, very much. And I mean,
yeah.
the whole idea of the Gothic mansion and the girl who's usually somehow the victim of this situation. I wanted to look at all that and embody that, but then transcend it and basically smash through that paradigm and claim it back and become the one who's actually in charge of the situation rather than being a victim of and at cause, to become the effect, not to become the cause, not just the effect.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of spectres in an exorcism, but one of the most alarming is the spectre of your family, I felt, and perhaps, but there's this wonderful kind of line that you have in it: "Mother dear, don't let me become like you. Don't ask me to sink and drown. Even to my young old eyes, a shroud is this wedding gown."
Yes.
So this is obviously quite kind of, you know, you're feeling the spectre of of your potential future in your mother's past. But I was also interested that by the time this was published, you must have just been turning 30, which I think is quite it's a moment of choice, I think, for women as well, isn't it?
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, you know, what I did in an exorcism, it's a kind of strange melange of taking the real people who were involved in my life and taking real situations, but then making those represent archetypal situations. So although my mother, she in fact ended up having a pretty strong marriage all the way through to the time that my father died in his 80s, and she made it to her 90s, but it was a strong relationship. But really I looked and I saw that the conventional life was not one that would make me happy and make me fulfilled. And so I used that as the archetype of all that marriage covenant and everything that that represented for women in life, and how in fact they so often lost their own journey of self-discovery in that process and became, you know, to having to hold and be in the old sense of things, which we've struck through quite a lot now, but at that time it was still very traditional in the sense that, you know, that the man is in charge and the woman is still in that sense of being the property rather than being her own woman. And so I felt very strongly that that wasn't a path that I wanted to take, because I wouldn't feel happy and fulfilled in that.
But it wasn't, I mean, was there a very like a conscious kind of feminist cutting loose of like, that is the way that the women of the previous generation were, or, and this is how I want to live life differently? Or was it just very much a personal response?
Oh no, it was very much looking at the whole situation and saying this isn't good enough. I mean, I remember hearing from different women that women didn't enjoy sex, that they just did it for their husbands as a sacrifice. And I thought, you know, this doesn't feel right to me. I don't think so. I actually kind of like these things, and I don't think that we should be feeling that this is a sacrifice, but I think it's a question of, again, owning our own sexuality, owning our right to pleasure, owning and declaring all of that, and not being minimized, but being maximized, and taking our liberation with all our senses intact, and bringing the whole baby through, not throwing it away with the bathwater.
Yes, there's this very strong theme of kind of religious oppression and the idea that the body is described as a site of shame, as something sinful. Did you have a religious upbringing, or was this more something that you were wanting to bring out as a big bit of societal oppression?
Not particularly religious, although my parents were Church of England, but that is the whole ingraining that we've had in the texture of our spiritual lives, going back to original sin. And I completely don't believe in original sin. I believe in original innocence. And so the idea of the founding all of this religious structure on the idea of original sin, and the woman as a temptress, and the snake is bad, and the snake is Kundalini, it's our inner fire. We've all got that, and that's something, our Shakti. We should own that and be proud of it, not see that as a wicked temptation that we have to shun and not eat that apple. I mean, I'm sure that apple's delicious. So to me, the way that Christianity and a lot of other spiritual paths see the flesh as sinful and having to be avoided was something that never sat well with me. And then I had a very direct experience as a 9-year-old girl. I chose to go to this convent school, and although I wasn't Roman Catholic, there was a girl who lived downstairs in our apartment block who went to this school, and I had this fantasy in my mind, because I always had these spiritual leanings and this questing. I thought, oh, this is this amazing sisterhood. I'm going to go there and I'm going to have all these revelations and it's going to be fantastic. So I refused to go to my other school. And in fact, my father would put me on the bus and I'd get off at the next stop. So they took me to a psychiatrist then, and she let me play with paint, and they said, well, you haven't let her get dirty enough, you must let her get more dirty, and she's very artistic, you must let her do what she wants to do. So they let me go to the convent school, but unfortunately that was very short lasting, only a year before I got expelled, and there is a notorious story about that, and I don't know if you want to hear it now, but...
Yes!
All right, so we used to go down to the swimming pool every week, and in the swimming pool, in the ladies' room, I'm 9 now, so I didn't really know yet about things, but there was a machine there, and we were told we weren't allowed to touch it. So, of course, being of the persuasion of wanting to do things I wasn't allowed to do, I was dared to open that machine. So I got into the machine and came out with this white pad. At that time, we didn't even have Tampax or anything. It was just a white pad. I thought, what is this? This is so disappointing. I thought it was going to be something exciting. But because I'd done it, I waved it out of the window on the way back as my trophy. And the nuns in charge got me to say, oh my goodness, guilty, shameful, sinful, terrible. They took me to the Mother Superior, and the Mother Superior said, terribly sinful actions, we're going to lock you in the room and call the parents. And I said, don't lock me in the room, and I bit her and I kicked her. But they locked me in the room, and I climbed out the window, and then I got expelled.
Wow. So I mean, but right there, it's not simply the body as a site of sin, it's the female body and the functions of the female body is unspeakable, untouchable.
I know, and you know, I couldn't even talk about that incident for years because I felt so ashamed, and I didn't even know why I was ashamed, but I was ashamed because they said it was sinful. And yes.
Well, flipping that completely on the head, I want to talk a bit about a book that I remember reading. I think I found it as a teenager in a friend's parents' room and was entranced by it, which is The Story of O.
Oh, yes.
Pauline Réage, because I feel there's a big influence from The Story of O in these photographs. I mean, there's the kind of chateau, there are the owl's head masks, there's the S&M imagery.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about, because the book was published in English in 1965, so I guess you were probably kind of like bang on, like a very influential, open to influence. There's a proper word for that, isn't it? Very susceptible. That's the one.
And
very susceptible, impressionable age to be reading it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the first book I remember I read of the erotic nature really was Lady Chatterley's Lover, and I did that when I was probably about 12, and I would read it on the train coming back from school so that my parents didn't know I was reading it. So that came first. But then later, when I was older, and with Peter in that period, I read Story of O, and I was very impressed by it because it's very atmospheric and challenged by it, and it made me think a lot because there's someone, it fascinated me, the idea of getting into a situation where you completely lose control, you know, have no control over things, and I think that's, you know, part of the whole drawing power of most of the underlying current of S&M in the sense is to become bound and tied and you're no longer in control. And in that state, you can reach a position of ecstasis, ecstasy, being outside of yourself, standing outside yourself. So that this idea of what you do to allow yourself to remove your ego, remove all the constraints of your normal conventional being, and be entering into some kind of altered state. So that fascinated me. Not that I really plunged into any dungeons and things myself that much, but as a thought form and as a concept and as a way of looking at how do we achieve ecstasy. I was always chasing after that, of course.
So you use quite a lot of S&M imagery in these photographs. Did you have to do a lot of, I mean, I don't want to pry too far, but were you kind of collecting erotic kind of imagery that you were drawing on, or?
Yes, I've always really done that, collected imagery that I'm interested in, and I was interested in that. But I like the imagery both from, yes, its literal sense in the way that I described it, of where it can take you to outside yourself, but also as symbolic languaging of the way that we feel trussed and bound in things, and then using the bondage to where I'm connected to the house in that way. I like the kind of multi-leveled nature of how one could use that imagery, not just in the context that we think within a certain kind of syndrome, but actually beyond that to look at things in how we are bound as beings, and how the play of power is something very significant. And I like the idea of describing being in two places at once, both the S and the M.
Yes, there's that lovely image where you've got the sequence of you bound and then you're kind of smiling and slipping out of the ropes as well, so it becomes this kind of
I like the turning of the tables, because I've always hated to be in boxes of any kind. And so I like the idea of that flipping of things, so that you're not stuck in one position. You're able to inhabit any position, really. And that's a lot to do with my approach to myself, too, as my own muse, being both subject and object at the same time.
And less, I mean, you use more kind of pornographic material in Mountain Ecstasy, but there is also some here that you've used in this series. I'm interested in how you see the process of transformation from that being in a magazine to being in your work, and what happens to it.
Well, Mountain Ecstasy, when you bring that up, I definitely used a lot of erotic material that we collected on our travels in Thailand, different places. And I actually found in the culture of Thailand that I love their erotica because there's a natural eroticism that's been kind of perverted and changed, you know, culturally by exposure to other thought forms, but there's natural kind of yogini energy and playful and light and very free and spontaneous. So I really was attracted to that and liked that, and felt that in that kind of languaging we had something that a lot of us uptight Westerners could learn from. So I wanted to transmit that through the work. And also I was performing an alchemy with it, because I was taking all these pieces that were in a pornographic context, but then putting them into a sacred context and showing them as part of nature and part of the erotic play of all things in the dance of life and the play of creation. And so for me, they were alchemized to become nothing sinful and dirty about them, but just a great celebration of beingness and the sports of the gods, just divine copulations. And so when Mountain Ecstasy was burnt by customs, it was to me just an example that they couldn't tell the difference between the raw material and the refinement and alchemization that I performed in the work that I did.
So it's the artist as alchemist, which
Absolutely.
is, yeah. What other materials, because you're drawing on quite, like a few different kind of bodies of imagery as well in the series. And there are these very graphic depictions of kind of an anatomical figures, for example,
Right.
which I still find quite difficult to look at, these kind of dissections.
That was, again, another story. Those photographs are photos I took myself. Apart from the anatomical drawings, there are actual dissected figures there. And that was when I was still a student. I wanted to try and overcome a certain kind of squeamishness that I had about blood and guts. And I've always taken this approach of facing my fears head on. And so, because that was something that kind of made me feel uneasy, I thought, okay, I'm going to try and deal with this aversion. So off I went to Guy's Hospital and worked in the dissecting room there and took the photographs there. And in fact, I ended up getting kind of thrown out of there too. Because unfortunately, I didn't realize that you weren't allowed to take away body parts. And I was making my mummy case, and the very kind technicians there working in the dissecting room gave me dissected brains and mummified arms and things, and I took them all back and used them in my mummy case. But on the way back to the art school, I had a big plastic bag with a black plastic bag with them in, and at one point one of the hands sort of came out, and people in the tube were a little shocked, and so I mentioned this in an article, and the head of Guy's Hospital saw that, and then there was all hell, and I think a couple of people lost their jobs, and I wasn't allowed back.
Wow. So the mummy case, does it still have human remains in it?
I don't have it anymore. No. It got stored for many, many years along with the bride and the bath by my parents in their storage, and then at a certain point, it was when I was living in the West Indies, I wasn't anywhere around. At a certain point they said, we can't keep paying for this anymore. I said, okay, let it go, and so they went.
Okay, because I'm now imagining it just being in some storage locker that somebody's going to unwittingly open. And it's, the mind boggles. That's amazing. So by the time that you finished, because I know it was a 7-year process, by the time you finished working on this, you'd already had what I think of as being a really transformative moment in your career. You'd gone to the Tantra exhibition at the Hayward Gallery. And that, I feel that was a really transformational experience for you. Was this kind of interest in spirituality, the spiritual aspect of the body, was this already very much part of the work that went into this series?
Yes, I mean, I as I described about liking secret teachings of all ages, it was because as I was researching for my thesis, I realized I loved the human body, and particularly the female body, and I wanted to do art and represent art that was to do with that, but not in a representational way, much more in a mythic, magical, a transformational way. And that's why I was so attracted to both the work of Max Ernst, which had transformed figures in all of it, and to, when I saw tantric iconography, it absolutely spoke to me directly. And before that, a lot in the Gnostic and alchemical works where everything is symbolic. And so it is what it is, but it is also magical and transcendent.
I know you've had problems with customs and also people on the tube, but I'm interested as to how the kind of feminist art world received your very kind of free presentation and free use of your sexuality in your work.
Well, I tried going to a couple of women's lib meetings and found that it wasn't really a fit for me because it was very political and it was also very heady. You know, it wasn't much to do with the body, and there was at that point in the movement, it's become changed now, much more integrated, which is why I will include feminist in descriptions of myself, feminist surrealist. But I wouldn't back then because I didn't feel in alignment with it, because I wanted to have sexuality included in this liberation, not deny it to get the liberation. And also, I didn't want to be more like a man in order to have the power. I wanted the power of the feminine to be recognized. And that's been my quest all my life. I would say the liberation of the feminine in all of us, male and female alike, has been absolutely central. But I haven't been identified with women's lib movements. However, when I met Jane Arden and the Women's Theatre Group, I really responded to that and became part of it, because it was very proactive and we're going to dig into our subconscious and we're going to pull out all this stuff and then we're going to make something from that and present it in this living theatre. And that to me felt, yes, this is the kind of work I'm interested in, but not so much in the kind of heady stuff or in the let's try and get the same kind of job rights, which is important work, of course, but that didn't feel like it was my particular venue. So a lot of the more hardline women's livers didn't really like what I was doing because they thought I was using my body and I shouldn't be. But someone like Laura Mulvey wrote a beautiful piece about me in Spare Rib saying, is there female fantasy? And she understood that I was dealing with the inner world and describing that, and she recognized that, and that to me transcends any other political stance.
We're talking about the kind of releasing the feminine aside, but I really want to hear you talk a bit about the importance of the figure of the hermaphrodite in your work, which is really, I mean, it's very central to this series, but it also appears in other series as well.
Yes. Well, my belief is that we are all male and female mixed together in our beings, and any work of art is a marriage of those parts. And, you know, it's both active and passive. All of these things to create something. You have to have laser-like perception, and then you have to surrender and let it happen through you. So, to me, that's always felt like the dynamic. And, of course, we're living in a rather different culture now than we were when I was growing up. But I wanted to confound those perceptions at that time. And as much as I played the shadow man in the Women's Theatre Group, I also would wear my suit and things and go out to parties and play with the idea that I was not just to be seen as this pretty young woman, but I could confound those kind of paradigms. And I'd also always been rather blatantly bisexual in the sense that I've always loved and admired women as much as I love men. I love all beings, and I also love that male and female inside myself, which is, to me, the font of my creativity, and both need to be recognized and seen, and the feminine needs to come up more now, both in men and women, because she's been so suppressed in all of us. And in that bag, although I think even gender definitions are a little bit of a red herring in the final sense of our spirituality, but, you know, in that bag, it's women need to be able to, you know, express all the qualities that are defined as women, but men need to be able to own and express those too. Things like intuitive knowing, things like the wisdom of the heart, things like sensitivity, which is so suppressed in men, to their detriment and to the detriment of our whole culture. So that, I believe, is something that we all need to reclaim, and that's my liberation of the feminine.
I want to finish up. We're going to open up to questions because I imagine there are lots and lots and lots and lots of questions for you, Penny. I seem to remember from last time it could have gone on for about 2 hours. I just want to finish up by talking about Bird Woman. So Bird Woman is a creation of your Age of Wisdom, I think we should call it. And I'm interested as to how, in the Age of Wisdom, you now look back on this work that was made almost 50 years ago, and whether you see things in it that you perhaps felt you weren't aware of at the time, how you read it, whether you still feel the same person. How is it coming back into this body of work?
Well, it is a journey that I've been through, and I'm no longer in that place of going through the journey. But at the same time, I recognize and own it all as part of me, and that is my journey. And that's who I am today, is because of going through that. And I see it as my dealing with my whole Western roots, the culture that I've been born into, dealing with all my psychology, all that I've kind of been come through me from blood lineage and all those things. And that was a very important part of my knowing myself. And only after doing that could I feel free to move on to the next part. And that's when I discovered Tantra. And then saw that the surrealism was dealing with the subconscious, and Tantra was dealing with the superconscious, but they're all the same language. You have the same kind of imagery, transcending and going through both. So as above, so below. That's the emerald tablet, and that's where I sit, holding all these pieces. And so this is part of my journey. We've been returning to it. We made this film in 2019, and if I didn't feel it as part of myself, I wouldn't be interested in still exploring. But, you know, in my father's home are many mansions. In my mother's womb are many dimensions. And this is a dimension that I am proud to inhabit, because I feel this heroine's journey, which it really was for me, is one which is archetypal, and one which offers roadmap to people in the dark nights of the soul that we all experience, and hopefully can shed some light in dark corners and bring some hope of salvation to when we feel alone and lost, because I'm trying to paint pictures of psychological states with my imagery here. And I don't really know another work that quite tried to do that, but I tried to evoke it to then exorcise the stuff I didn't want. So if I was feeling in a chapter perpetual loss, that I just felt loss, how do you deal with that? And we all have to deal with loss in our lives. And so I wanted to try and show an Ariadne thread through this labyrinth, so that others in the darkness could find a light and come through and claim their own key to their own mansion.
Yeah, and you do get very, very dark in it. You know, there's talking about suicidal ideation, jealousy. I mean, it goes to all of the most difficult places.
Yes, yes, but we all have to deal with these things in our lives, sometime or another, some way or another. And I found that I didn't like to feel jealousy, and so I wanted to deal with that, but I couldn't deal with it unless I really confronted it. And so that was my modus operandi there.
Thank you so much, Penny. We're going to open up to you guys now. I think, have we got 15 minutes? I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if you pop your hand up, I'll try and get through everyone. Or maybe we have no questions. I find this very hard to believe. We've got one right at the back.
I wonder, like, you're talking about reading the secret teachings and stuff, but I was interested, especially because you've got, like, the imagery of the...
I can't hear you. Can you come closer, maybe?
I can just shout louder, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, you were talking about reading the secret teachings and books like that, but I was interested in if you were also reading kind of some of the more archaeological theological texts were around in the 70s, so I'm thinking about like Maria de Brutus or like the Chalice and the Blade and those sorts of texts about thinking about women's place in sort of a deeper history.
I didn't actually read that at the time, no, I didn't. But yeah, I did read a lot of different things, and of course a lot of the surrealist kind of literature. Another writer was Juna Barnes, who I found to be very evocative. Sylvia Plath I adored as a poetess. All these women who have struggled to find themselves in an unfriendly society. And so, you know, those who walk on the wild side, all those I tracked when they spoke the language of that quest and related to that.
Thank you. Do we have another question? We've suddenly got lots, right. We're going to go 1, and we had 1 in the middle, 2, 3. So if you go over there.
Hi, I was thinking about like how this might have been received at the time. And in the moment in the 70s, there was kind of this, you kind of had your Angela Carter's and your Andrea Dworkin's, right, your kind of clashing of approaches to feminism and the body. And a lot of the imagery kind of depicts a lot of pain or violence. I was kind of wondering what you are doing with that in the work. Where is that going? What effect are you kind of trying to spin?
Well, I hate to cite someone quite as grand as Jesus Christ, but he did show us a path through pain. He showed, I realized this, I had a vision and a revelation at one point in my life because I was, you know, I disowned Christianity because it was limiting me because of all the doctrine being just terrible dogma that limited people, which I then realized in my vision that it didn't come from Jesus himself, but by how it's been translated. But in this vision, I understood the gift that he gave, and he showed how any being can go through the hardest, deepest extremes of spiritual, psychological, and physical degradation, pain, and agony, and come out sovereign because he offered total and complete forgiveness. He gave, in that moment of his transcendence, absolute forgiveness. And that forgiveness was like a vibration that opened up portals throughout the dimensions, and he claimed his sovereignty above and beyond all pain in that moment. And I'm on a similar trip.
And we had the question that was there in the middle. Yes.
You so beautifully and eloquently describe the context in which you created this work, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your process today and what motivates and inspires you today, whether it's the same things as the context of this work, perhaps.
Well, 2 things I'll say. One, a big work that I'm in the middle of at the moment is doing my archives. So the archives is, for me, a mega collage where I'm recapitulating and owning and honoring all the facets and different journeys of my life as art. And in that reclaiming, I'm hoping again to make these big pathways and this big map. Because I stepped outside the art world for quite a long time, not really deliberately, it just happened, but that allowed me to have a freedom to explore many more facets of what it means to be an artist than I think would probably have happened if I'd stayed in the mainstream of being a successful artist. So I'm grateful for that, although I'm now wanting to claim my position in the history of art because I don't want to be sidelined. And in the same thought form, now that I'm older, I realize that as I did 50% the Visible Woman when I was a young woman, wanting to show it's not just my pretty face, it's what I've got inside. Now as an older woman, I want to say it's not just my aging face, it's what I've got inside, and I am of value, and I don't want to become invisible again now because I'm not a hot young chick. Therefore, I am trying with the work today, and I'm doing a series called My Body, where I've been using myself naked as my own muse again at this phase in my life. I'm trying to claim the right to visibility for our wise women and elders, and that body of experience that needs to send what it knows back into our cultural matrix so that it can percolate and fertilize and allow us to evolve. Because if we don't own that, we are left immature as a culture. So that's my work now.
Amazing.